Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Ridge Forrester had always been the unshakable pillar of the Forrester family, the man who stood tall even in storms that would have destroyed anyone else, but the moment they wheeled him into the emergency room unconscious, unresponsive, hooked to machines that seemed louder than anyone's heartbeat in the room, everything changed. It was as if time stood still around the broken body of the man everyone thought was invincible. Brooke couldn't stop shaking as she pressed her hand against the cool metal rail of his hospital bed, whispering prayers that sounded more like desperate apologies for every fight, every disagreement, every moment she wished she could take back. Steffi stood frozen near the doorway with tears streaking down her face, still in shock from the phone call that sent her racing from the Cliff House to the hospital. And Thomas, who had been wrestling with his own inner conflict for months, stared in numb disbelief as doctors swarmed his father, trying to stabilize vital signs that refused to cooperate. The accident had been sudden, violent, catastrophic, and no one could explain why Ridge's car veered off the road in the first place. But the deeper question, the one that nobody wanted to voice out loud, lingered in the air between the beeping monitors and the hushed footsteps of nurses. Was this really an accident? Eric Forrester entered the hospital like a ghost emerging from a storm, silent, pale, hollow-eyed, and carrying an expression that nobody could immediately read. This was not the confident patriarch who commanded boardrooms and family gatherings with a serene authority. This was a man who looked haunted. His steps were slow, heavy, and yet there was something simmering beneath the surface, something unsettling that flickered through his gaze as he approached Ridge's room. He paused at the doorway, gripping the frame as if his legs might give out beneath him. Of all the people affected by Ridge's accident, Eric was the one whose emotions were the most complicated, the most unpredictable and dangerously volatile. Rumors had been swirling for weeks in the Forrester corridors, whispers that Eric felt Ridge had betrayed him during his health crisis, betrayed him professionally, and even betrayed him personally by dismissing certain decisions Eric believed were rightfully his. And although Ridge had survived the dramatic fallout from Eric's medical scare, the tension between them had never fully dissolved. When Eric stepped toward his son's bed, Brooke held her breath, unsure whether she should comfort him or guard Ridge from whatever storm Eric brought with him. The faint hum of machines filled the silence as Eric stood beside Ridge, staring down at his son's unmoving form. His expression softened for only a moment, revealing the grief that was tearing through him. But then something darker clouded his features, something almost like anger. He clenched the bed rail with trembling fingers, his knuckles turning white, as if he were fighting emotions too powerful to contain. Brooke stepped cautiously toward him, her voice low, trembling and thick with tears as she tried to reassure him, explaining the doctor's grim report, but Eric didn't seem to hear her. His mind was elsewhere, spiraling into memories, resentments, unresolved confrontations, and the deeply rooted wounds that had resurfaced long before this accident. His silence itself felt like a message, one that sent a ripple of unease through everyone in the room. Was it grief? Was it guilt? Or was it something much more dangerous, the early flicker of revenge against whoever might have caused Ridge's crash? As news of Ridge's condition spread beyond the hospital walls, the Forrester family found itself split between panic, suspicion, and fear. Hope rushed in with tears streaming down her cheeks, clinging to Brooke as she whispered that she couldn't lose another father figure. Liam, though shaken, offered what support he could, trying to steady the family even as he processed his own shock. Carter arrived moments later, his calm demeanor barely holding as he tried to comfort Steffi and Thomas, though he too couldn't ignore the rising tension that had begun to thicken the air around Eric. Even RJ, who had always idolized his father, stood in stunned silence as he took in the sight of Ridge's still body. But the real unrest began when whispers started circulating. Whispers about the accident scene. According to early reports, Ridge's brakes may have failed. And while that could be chalked up to mechanical malfunction, some people, especially those who knew the intricate history of the Forrester family, immediately wondered if foul play was involved, and whether Eric, in his volatile emotional state, believed someone had tried to hurt Ridge, or whether he believed Ridge had somehow earned this tragedy through past wrongs. At the mansion, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing hour. Pam, who was usually the one to keep spirits high during disasters, stood in the kitchen wringing her hands, unable to bake or joke or do anything to break the tension. Katie sat in the living room with Donna, both of them teary-eyed as they whispered prayers and tried to keep each other grounded. But the focus remained on Eric, his puzzling calmness, his long stretches of silence, and the intensity with which he questioned everyone who returned from the hospital. He asked Thomas about the crash scene. He questioned Steffi about Ridge's emotional state before the accident. He pressed Carter for details he didn't have. Even Brooke noticed the strange fixation in Eric's voice, the way he kept circling back to one question. Do we know if someone tampered with the car? His insistence sent a chill down Brooke's spine. She had seen Eric angry before, furious even. But this anger was different, colder, more dangerous, grounded not in immediate rage but in something calculated. Something that hinted at retribution. When the police arrived at the hospital to gather preliminary information, the entire dynamic shifted. Steffi stepped forward to answer their questions, but she couldn't stop her voice from breaking as she described what she knew, which wasn't much. Thomas remained composed, offering what details he could, though his mind was clouded with worry. But Eric, who had remained in the background for most of the questioning, suddenly stepped in with unexpected authority. His tone was clipped, firm and unyielding as he insisted they investigate every possibility, especially sabotage. His forcefulness startled everyone, even the officers, who delicately assured him they would explore all leads. Yet Eric's expression didn't soften. If anything, the tension in his jaw intensified, hinting at a man ready to take matters into his own hands if he felt justice wasn't served. And somewhere in the background, lurking beneath the grief and uncertainty, the possibility emerged that Eric already had someone in mind. Someone he suspected might have wanted Ridge harmed. Someone he believed deserved payback. As Ridge's condition worsened, the hospital waiting area became a battleground of emotions. Brooke and Taylor found themselves standing side by side for the first time in months, united in fear despite their complicated history. Steffi broke down several times, each sob echoing through the sterile hallway as Finn tried to hold her steady. Finn, meanwhile, consulted with every specialist available, desperate to find a treatment option that could stabilize Ridge's deteriorating brain activity. But every new test brought the same bleak outlook. Ridge might not wake up. Or if he did, he might never be the same. The thought shattered the family all over again. But it was Eric's reaction that unnerved everyone the most. Instead of collapsing with the rest of them, he grew eerily calm. Too calm. He stood against the wall with his arms crossed, his eyes cold and distant, as though he were planning something. Something beyond the medical crisis, something outside the hospital walls, something rooted in anger rather than grief. When Carter approached him, gently suggesting they focus on supporting one another, rather than looking for someone to blame prematurely, Eric's reaction was sharp, almost chilling. He accused Carter of being naive, of not understanding the patterns that had been forming recently within the family. He alluded to betrayals that had gone unpunished, to tensions that had risen too high, to warnings Ridge had supposedly ignored. It was enough to make Carter step back, unsettled by the darkness in Eric's tone. Even Donna, who had always been able to soothe Eric in moments of turmoil, found herself unable to break through the icy resolve beginning to take hold within him. She wrapped her arms around him, pleading with him to let the police handle the investigation, but Eric barely responded. His thoughts were spiraling elsewhere, toward justice, vengeance, and the belief that someone out there was responsible for Ridge's suffering. And if the police didn't find that person, Eric would. Days passed, but Ridge's condition remained critical. Each sunrise brought more dread than hope. Finn spent hours reviewing Ridge's scans, consulting with neurosurgeons, and searching for an intervention that didn't exist. Steffi and Thomas alternated staying by Ridge's bedside, whispering stories from childhood, hoping some fragment of familiarity might draw their father back to them. Brooke never left the hospital except to shower, and even then she returned within minutes. But the shifting energy around Eric became impossible to ignore. He started making calls, long private calls he refused to explain. He met with people quietly, stepping outside the hospital whenever someone arrived who seemed unfamiliar to the rest of the family. He questioned staff. He asked for access to Ridge's personal records, work files, digital communications. It was behavior that alarmed even his closest friends. And although he never explicitly said the word revenge, The implication was always there, simmering beneath every action he took, every pointed comment he made, every moment his eyes darkened with the weight of unspoken fury. Meanwhile, the police uncovered new information. Investigators revealed that Ridge's accident was not caused by simple brake failure. There were signs of deliberate tampering. The news hit the family like a second tragedy, sending shockwaves through the hospital walls. Brooke collapsed into tears, Steffi nearly fainted, and Thomas punched the wall in frustration, furious that someone had deliberately targeted their father. But Eric's reaction was the most alarming. He didn't look surprised. Not even a little. His jaw clenched, his fists tightened, and without uttering a word, he walked out of the waiting area and down the hallway, disappearing without explanation. It was the moment everyone realized Eric hadn't simply been afraid. He had expected this outcome. And that meant one terrifying thing. He had a suspect in mind. When Eric returned hours later, his demeanor had shifted entirely. He no longer looked haunted or lost. He looked determined, frighteningly determined. He informed Brooke, Steffi, and Thomas that he had contacts, working independently to uncover the truth, people who would not be limited by legal boundaries or procedural delays. The family erupted in protest, begging him to stop before he did something he couldn't undo. But Eric refused. He insisted that whoever harmed Ridge needed to pay, needed to suffer even, and he was not going to let the law dictate the timeline or the method for justice. Donna broke down crying, pleading for him to let go of this darkness, reminding him of the man he had always been. Compassionate, fair, loving. But Eric, with tears in his eyes and fire in his voice, told her that love was the very reason he couldn't let this go. Someone had attacked his son. Someone had nearly killed him. And if Ridge didn't survive, Eric would make sure someone else didn't survive either. As suspicions began to swirl, theories surfaced throughout the Forrester ecosystem. Could Bill Spencer have done something reckless again? Could Sheila Carter have resurfaced with another deadly plan? Could Deacon Jack, or even a lesser-known rival, have played a role? The family couldn't agree. But Eric seemed certain. He spoke in cryptic fragments, hinting at past conflicts, old enemies, people who had reasons to want Ridge out of the way. And though he wouldn't reveal the name he had in mind, the cold confidence in his eyes terrified everyone. Brooke begged him to trust the process, but Eric countered that trusting the process was what had almost cost him his legacy, his company, and his life months ago when Ridge doubted his abilities and decisions. This, Eric argued, was personal. The emotional climax came 3 days later when Ridge's condition unexpectedly worsened. Nurses rushed into the room as alarms blared, calling for Finn and the on-call trauma team. The Forrester family huddled outside the room, trembling, crying, praying, while Eric stood motionless against the wall, his face drained of color. For a moment, the possibility of losing Ridge suddenly stripped away all anger, leaving only grief. And then a miracle. Ridge stabilized. Barely. But it was enough to pull him back from the edge. Enough to give the family renewed hope. Enough to break Eric's icy resolve for a moment as he whispered his son's name in a cracked voice. But as soon as Ridge survived the night, Eric's vengeance ignited again. And now, with sabotage confirmed, with emotions boiling, with the family united in fear but divided in suspicion, the question becomes, if Ridge wakes up, will he reveal who hurt him? And if he doesn't, is Eric already planning to take revenge into his own hands, no matter the cost? The morning after Ridge's miraculous stabilization felt surreal. The hospital was quieter than usual, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if the fragile thread of life holding Ridge together would snap again. Brooke had camped out by his bedside all night, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat, refusing to let herself leave the man who had been the center of her world for decades. Her hand remained clasped in his, fingers entwined as though sheer will could keep him alive. Steffi and Thomas rotated in shifts, speaking softly to him, telling him stories from their childhood, reminding him of memories only the family shared, hoping that some fragment of consciousness might flicker through the haze of medication and trauma. Even Finn, despite his calm professionalism, looked exhausted, but he never left Ridge's side, monitoring every vital, every response, every subtle shift in color or breath that could signify improvement or decline. The room had become a fortress, a sacred space where the Forrester family gathered to guard Ridge's life. Yet outside its walls, shadows of suspicion and fear began to creep, infiltrating the mansion and even the corporate world of Forrester Creations. Eric, however, had disappeared once again. His absence was noticeable, gnawing at Brooke and the others. It wasn't until mid-morning that a nurse quietly approached Brooke and whispered that Eric had left for a private meeting. No explanation, no phone calls, no word of where he was going. Brooke's stomach tightened. She could sense it. Eric's mind was no longer fully on Ridge. It was on the person responsible. And the dangerous glimmer in his eyes from the night before had not disappeared. If anything, it had sharpened. Steffi, ever vigilant and painfully aware of her father's past with Eric's volatile tendencies, whispered to Brooke that they might need to intervene before Eric went too far. But Brooke's response was barely audible. "We can't stop him. We can't lose Ridge. Not now." At the Forrester mansion, tension was building to a fever pitch. Donna had returned home after a sleepless night at the hospital, trying to coordinate with Katie, Pam, and even Ridge's longtime associates to gather any information about potential suspects. Everyone was on edge. Every phone ring, every email ping, every shadow outside the window seemed suspect. Rumors of sabotage were circulating faster than facts. Pam, whose intuition had often saved the family in past crises, sensed that someone close to Ridge, someone within the orbit of the family or the company, might be hiding a secret. "It's never random with Ridge," she whispered to Katie, who nodded solemnly. "It's personal. Someone wanted this to happen, and Eric knows it." Meanwhile, Eric had convened a private meeting with several old contacts, people who were willing to go beyond legal boundaries to uncover the truth. They gathered in a nondescript conference room at Forrester Creations, speaking in hushed tones. Eric's commanding presence dominated the room, but there was no hint of his usual warmth or humor. Instead, he radiated a lethal focus, a mix of grief and calculated anger that made even the most hardened operatives uneasy. "We will find the person who did this," Eric stated flatly, his gaze sweeping the room like a predator scanning the terrain. "And when we do, justice will be absolute." His words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding, leaving no doubt that the man before them was ready to take extreme measures. Back at the hospital, Ridge's condition remained fragile. Each hour brought a mix of small victories and terrifying setbacks. Finn adjusted medications, closely monitored vitals, and consulted with neurosurgeons multiple times, while Steffi and Thomas alternated between hope and panic, afraid that a single misstep could cost their father his life. Brooke, still clinging to Ridge's hand, refused to leave the room even for a short break, silently pleading with Ridge's unconscious form. "Please wake up," she whispered over and over, her voice raw with emotion. "I need you. The kids need you. We can't lose you, Ridge. Not now. Not ever." Her words, though unheard by Ridge in a literal sense, resonated through the energy of the room, creating a fragile cocoon of love and desperation that somehow seemed to cling to him. The investigation into Ridge's accident intensified outside the hospital. Police continued to gather evidence, documenting the tampered brake system, reviewing traffic cameras, and interviewing anyone who had been near Ridge the night of the crash. Yet the more they dug, the more complicated the situation became. It was no longer just an accident. It had become a high-stakes mystery involving corporate rivalries, personal vendettas, and long-buried family tensions. And while the investigators remained focused on uncovering hard evidence, Eric had already begun to connect the dots in ways only he could, linking subtle patterns of behavior, past confrontations, and hints of resentment that others might dismiss as coincidence. To Eric, nothing about this incident was coincidental. Ridge had survived, yes, but the orchestrator of this disaster would not escape scrutiny, nor punishment. At the Forrester mansion, the tension between the family members began to surface. Steffi confronted Thomas, accusing him of withholding information, questioning whether he had noticed anything unusual about Ridge's behavior or conversations leading up to the crash. Thomas, defensive and frustrated, argued that he had done everything he could to protect his father, that Ridge had been cautious, and that blaming family members would only tear them apart at a time when unity was crucial. Brooke intervened, trying to calm both of them, but her own nerves were fraying. Every shadow, every sudden noise, every unexpected visitor triggered panic. The idea that someone could deliberately harm Ridge was almost too much to bear. And amidst this chaos, Eric remained a looming figure, absent physically, yet dominating every conversation, every plan, every speculation. By the second night, Ridge's condition showed tentative improvement. The doctors cautiously adjusted sedation, hoping he might regain consciousness. The family gathered around the bed, holding his hands, talking to him in whispers, recounting family stories, urging him to fight. Brooke's voice cracked repeatedly as she spoke, and Steffi sobbed softly, her face buried in her father's blanket. Thomas, usually composed, was visibly shaken, and Finn kept checking monitors, quietly urging patience and calm even as his own exhaustion mounted. The room was filled with a tension that teetered between hope and despair, fragile yet unbreakable, like a glass sculpture held together by sheer willpower. Suddenly, an unexpected visitor arrived. Ridge's old friend and confidant, Ridge's longtime business ally, who had known him since the earliest days of Forrester Creations. He entered quietly, eyes flicking to Eric's seat at the head of the waiting area. Though Eric wasn't there as usual, the visitor brought with him subtle news, details he had uncovered about Ridge's accident that hadn't yet reached the family. Someone had been seen near the crash site shortly before it happened, lingering suspiciously, behaving in a manner that suggested premeditation. The revelation sent a ripple of fear through Brooke, Steffi, and Thomas. Could this person be tied to Eric's own suspicions? And if so, what would Eric do once he discovered the truth? Eric returned late that night, his expression unreadable. He entered the hospital room quietly, observing Ridge with a cold intensity that unsettled everyone present. Brooke's eyes met his, pleading silently. "Not now, Eric. Please just be here for him, not for revenge." Eric nodded briefly, almost imperceptibly, before returning his attention to Ridge. For a moment he seemed almost like the man they had always known, worried, loving, deeply invested in his son's well-being. But when the family's backs were turned, Eric pulled out his phone, making another cryptic call. His words were clipped, cold, and commanding, revealing a resolve that chilled everyone who overheard. Find out everything. Every detail. No one escapes. The tone was not that of a grieving father. It was that of a man plotting, preparing, and executing a plan that could have far-reaching consequences. The next day, Ridge's eyes fluttered open. The room erupted in relief, tears, and soft laughter. Brooke clutched his hand, sobbing openly, as Steffi and Thomas both knelt beside him, brushing hair from his forehead, whispering reassurances. Finn, ever the professional, monitored vital signs but allowed a small smile, relieved that the immediate crisis was over. Yet Eric's gaze remained fixed, unblinking. He didn't smile, didn't cry, didn't show the relief the rest of the family did. His mind was already racing, analyzing, strategizing, and anticipating the next steps. Ridge had survived, but to Eric, the survival of his son only heightened the urgency of finding and confronting the person responsible. And deep down, everyone in the room sensed it. When Eric acted, nothing, not law, not loyalty, not family, would stand in his way. The following week brought more discoveries. The police traced fingerprints and vehicle tracks, narrowing the list of suspects. At the same time, Eric began making quiet moves within the company, subtly shifting power, questioning loyalties, and gathering intelligence that only someone as cunning and experienced as he could manage. Rumors spread like wildfire. Had Eric been aware of the saboteur before the crash? Was he manipulating events from behind the scenes? Every member of the Forrester family felt the weight of uncertainty. Each conversation was loaded with suspicion. Every glance, every phone call, every meeting carried the unspoken fear of Eric's wrath. Fear that had nothing to do with Ridge's condition and everything to do with what Eric might do when he discovered the truth. By now, Ridge was stabilized, but not fully recovered. His movements were limited, his speech slow and measured, and his mind clouded by the trauma of the accident and the medication keeping him alive. Brooke remained his constant companion, while Steffi and Thomas alternated shifts, determined not to leave him alone. Finn continued to monitor, offering suggestions, reviewing scans, and coordinating with specialists across the country for any potential interventions that could aid recovery. But amidst all the medical attention, the personal drama deepened. The family realized that the accident had not only endangered Ridge's life, but had also exposed hidden fractures in relationships, loyalties, and trust, cracks that could be exploited by Eric's relentless pursuit of justice or revenge. And then a shocking twist. One of the suspects emerged from the shadows, someone no one had expected, someone whose proximity to the Forrester family allowed them access to Ridge's life in ways that were both intimate and alarming. The revelation caused immediate panic. Steffi wanted to confront the person directly. Brooke wanted to call the police immediately. Thomas wanted to strategize, weighing the consequences of exposure against the family's safety. Eric, however, saw the opportunity differently. His mind raced with possibilities, revenge plans, and the need to assert control over a situation that had already spiraled into chaos. The stage was set for a confrontation that could change everything. Eric versus the saboteur, Ridge's survival hanging in the balance, and the entire Forrester family caught in the crossfire.